What's up?
Tyler. What's up, my man?
Uh-oh. I can't hear you. You hear me?
You can't hear me right now?
Maybe not working.
You can't hear me right now?
Oh yeah, now I got you.
You got me? Sweet. How you doing, man?
Yeah, that's weird. What if this space is too dark? We don't want to use this dingy room.
We're getting reports that
Can't hear you again.
You can't hear me? We're getting reports that people can hear both of us, so that's a good sign.
That's why. Okay, I know why. When I plugged it, it doesn't have sound, audio. Now say something.
Yeah, you can hear me now?
That's why, yeah, stupid thing. It's really nice, but it's a real pain in the ass to do courses like this because it disallows me from hearing anything or people hearing videos. So I will just not.
From like the webinar platform?
Yeah, it's just a Rode wire mic, which works really good and the sound is good, but there's no audio feedback to me from it, so I can't hear anything.
Copy that.
But I don't know, is this light? This light looks like shit compared to yours. Yours looks great. Mine looks terrible. Maybe I'll.
So, just so everybody knows, Tyler, you and I are live right now. We've got pulling up some notes really quick. Looks like we've got about 80-ish people that have joined us as of right now that are live. So everyone, if you're here, we're here with Dr. Tyler Nelson, and he's covering the Understanding Adaptive Capacity Clinic. Super stoked to have you, Tyler.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So kind of funny story, Tyler. The team and I originally had thought about the idea of running like multiple clinics at one time and letting participants, choose between like different rooms kind of. And I was going to be the teacher, the other expert in the other clinic during the same time you were teaching. But the team was a little worried that no one would go to your clinic. They'd all go to mine. And I don't think it was because of the fact that I was teaching, but I think it was because of the topic that I was thinking about covering. And
was the topic like finger training for the professional or become a professional finger trainer?
Pretty close. It was longevity and synchronized swimming.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Or how to eat an entire pizza in like 3 minutes. Those are my two expert topics that I can cover. So
sweet.
Yeah.
Mine could have been like, consuming donuts, like wow. Another hot topic that I'm into.
I love it.
And I'm going to be able to share my screen, right? Even though I'm not the host, correct? Okay.
Yeah, I've made you co-host now, so you can share the screen.
Oh, that sounds official.
Yeah, dude. We're having some reports that people can't see anything. I'm not sure. One person said that. If maybe anybody else can plug in that you guys can see us and hear us okay.
1 of 100 is a pretty good ratio.
Yeah, that's not bad at all. So in actuality, Tyler, like your clinic is, the only reason I can pull that joke is because your clinic is one of the highest attending clinics so far, slated for all of these. So I don't want to take up too much of your time because ultimately people want to hang out with you and have you share your expertise. Everybody who's participating today, you're learning from one of the best in the game. Quick intro, and let me cover a couple of things on kind of Gnarly's end. So I'm Eli Kerr. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Gnarly, and I get the opportunity to do a quick kind of intro for the clinic. Just for those of you that don't know, Gnarly offers, and makes all natural products that are sports nutrition products. They're NSF certified, and they're natural, healthy, quality products that also taste delicious. You can go on our website and see, a ton of reviews. Mostly all of them are good. A ton of reviews, right? A ton of reviews that shows that people really love the flavors of our products. So, but really over the next couple of months, we're focused on education. Primarily education around preventing injuries, dealing with injuries, recovery tips, and trying to kind of do it from a holistic perspective. So not just focused on nutrition. And we're calling this longevity in sport. We have a super stellar lineup. Those of you that are joining us today, I hope that you're going to join us in other clinics. You can sign up for as many as you want. They don't cost anything. Another cool thing that's happening during the time that we're doing these clinics is we're launching a new product, Gnarly Collagen Pro. At Gnarly, we think it's pretty important that people don't just take products because someone says so, but that they actually learn, the importance of why to take the product, or really understanding the why behind it. And what's cool about collagen is it really helps with injury prevention, repair of tendons and ligaments, and general your joints. And so it ultimately helps you do more of what you love, and fits perfectly into this theme of longevity in sports, So for last couple of kind of housekeeping items, after we record this tomorrow at some point, everyone will receive a recording of this clinic, because you're going to love it so much. You can just keep rewatching Tyler teach you over and over again, right?
Hopefully bad words.
Put it on auto replay.
Yeah.
But in that email, we'll also be sending out a discount for you to try out our new product, Collagen Pro. And there's another free gift that will be attached to that. Also, in another 2 weeks, we're going to be launching a huge giveaway with a bunch of products that include Gnarly products and other brands throwing in stuff. And so if you watch our Instagram or follow us on social, watch for that announcement. Also, we would love to have your guys' help to continue to spread these clinics and get them to people, who may be interested. In fact, someone's just asked, they missed yesterday's clinic. Is it possible to receive a recording? Unfortunately, it's not, unless you pre-registered. So you got to pre-register for the clinics that you're interested in. And what's cool is, even if you can't make the live recording like today, as long as you register, we'll send you the recorded video of it, so you can watch it whenever you want. Like I said, now people can fall asleep watching Tyler in the middle of the night when they're bored and they want to pull up your video. They can watch it. So we're asking you guys' help. If you love what you're learning, if Tyler says something that's really profound and you want to pass that on, please, create some kind of social story or post and tag Gnarly, tag Tyler, and encourage your other friends to come to our clinics. At the end of this clinic, you'll get the opportunity to do just a short survey, and part of it gives us some feedback about what you learned and what you liked. It also gives you the opportunity to give Tyler some kudos so we can pass them on to him. The one thing that I want to mention to everybody, and Tyler may go over it depending on how he kind of runs his presentation, but there's a QA button that's at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask Tyler any questions at any point, you know, please use that Q&A, and we'll use that to get the questions to Tyler. So
those are like after, not today.
no, they can do it. It's for today.
Send them to me later.
Yeah, if you want to
do I need to like stop and answer them? I would need to stop and answer them today.
If you want to, we can also ignore them.
Okay.
Tyler,
I mean, 113 people. I'm assuming a lot of these people have taken courses from me, and so I was actually very good, and I only have 10 slides, but we'll eat up 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time at the end, and and we can cover some of it, you know, I can help I'll help manage all that too.
Cool.
So I'll be here.
Is this a strict hour, or we can?
We can go extend it a little bit if you're cool, Tyler.
Okay.
I'm sure everybody else will be super stoked, whatever you're gonna give.
Okay.
And then I mean, again, we'll record it, and if people need to drop off, they can drop off, and they'll still get the recording, and they can watch the end, you know. So
okay, I see that. So I will make sure I stop. All right, speak slowly.
We don't have to be hardcore with the rules. So.
Oh yeah, cool. All right, that's not how I roll anyway. So good.
So kind of with that, then, you know, Tyler, I'll just gauge your temperature as far as opening it up for Q&A. I'm sure people will have tons of questions. But let's get into this. So again, the topic that Dr. Tyler Nelson's covering today is understanding adaptive capacity. And I just want to give a quick intro to Tyler. He's a second generation chiropractic physician who owns and operates Camp4 Human Performance, C4HP on the IG, if you guys have seen it. In graduate school, he completed a dual doctorate master's degree in exercise science with an emphasis on tendon loading and rehabilitation. Excuse me. He completed his master's degree at the University of Missouri and was a physician for athletics departments for 4 years out of college. He currently works around the world managing clients via telehealth and in his office in Utah. So he's local here to us. He's also certified strength and conditioning specialist through the NSCA and teaches conferences worldwide on a host of topics. He started rock climbing with a love for big wall adventures in Yosemite and Zion National Park. Due to family and work obligations, he tends to focus on bouldering as his primary climbing discipline. So Tyler, we welcome you, and thanks again for being here. We're stoked to have you.
Thanks.
It's all you.
I'm sold out to bouldering versus trad climbing, which is how I enter. Thanks for having me here. It's awesome. I think people dig the Gnarly products because of just the company. There's few people that don't know that name already because what the company stands for, which is cool. So I'm psyched. I'm always happy to do presentations. So let's get into this information. The adaptive capacity. I'm going to share my screen with you all, and I can't see you all, which is really. I can see me and Eli's face on his Instagram, but I can't see anyone else. So I'm going to talk to myself. What are adaptive capacity? This is a topic I was excited to present on because people usually hear me talk about. When people hear me doing presentation account, it's either about velocity-based training, isometric applications for training, rehabilitation, but this is not any of those. This is all of those combined, and we're going to talk about can have sustainable training habits, or we could have unsustainable training habits as a mechanism to understand whether we're going to actually have a longevity of our training, so we can continue. Essentially, all these credentials that Eli read, I hate it when those things are read, but everyone. It's really just I went to a lot of school, And that's a good thing because I really love what I do and I really enjoy teaching. So in that regard, all these logos down here, these are just businesses that I either work for and I work there. And then Exergo, if you're not familiar with the Exergo, is the strain gauge that is attached to another application, which is how we assess rock climbing athletes. And then Native Climbing is a company overseas, and they make granite climbing holds, and I'm with them right now on a skin conditioning product. And then Be Strong Training is a company that makes a blood flow restriction that I teach for as well. So those are some of the businesses that I'm affiliated with. One thing that I was really excited, yeah, go ahead.
I was just jumping in real quick because we're having a couple people mention that the audio from you is a little bit spotty.
Like, let me see if I move to another room closer to my router. Let me see. That does happen in this house, which is weird because we seem to pay a lot of money for our internet, which I'm sure everyone does, but this room is much darker. Is that any better?
Yeah, let's roll with that for a while and see
Okay.
how we do.
Okay, so
thanks everybody for being patient.
Yeah, sorry, I was enjoying the light in the other room, but this will be fine. So one of the things that I did for this presentation is I made all these images as infographics, which I'm assuming all of you will get access to this course through the slides. Maybe if not, you can contact me if you're interested in these graphics. But what we're going to try and understand over the next hour or 40 minutes is, understanding the external loads impact on the internal system, which is like, there's lots of types of stress. There's the external stressors that we succumb to when we're training, but they also impose an internal load on our body. And understanding that balance is what keeps people from getting injured. That's the adaptive capacity idea and this concept of allostasis. And it's likely everyone's heard of homeostasis, but homeostasis is not necessarily accurate for biological organisms. Allostasis is this constant flux where we're increasing a stress and then we're reducing a stress. And we're constantly trying to find this balance because there's so many moving parts. The one thing, and on the bottom left-hand side right here, this is a stress adaptation recovery graph. And I'm sure all of you have seen this, in a general adaptation syndrome or general adaptation type of model, we see this big deficit right here. And this deficit is essentially the cost of whatever it is that we're doing. We have some sort of cost or some stressor, and then our body adapts to it. And then after our body adapts to it appropriately, then we recover or we return to baseline. The thing that people don't really understand is that this is a non-linear relationship. So down here on this image, I have 3 different colors, and those represent 3 different responses. It could be 3 different athletes. It could be 3 different exercises. It could be 3 different days with the same exercise. And the reality is the internal load that we accumulate on a daily basis is a moving target, and it's never linear to the magnitude of the external stressor. That's a really simplified view of understanding stress and our response to stress. So 2 athletes, I mentioned this kind of briefly, 2 athletes, and on the image right there, I said it could be multiple athletes or the same athlete with different exercises or different days. But if I take two athletes, let's say another individual my same size, 5'10", 155, and I'm in better shape than he is, and if we walk to the top of a stadium, a football stadium, many stairs, the individual that's not in that good a shape, that same external stressor imposes a much greater internal load on him or myself than it would the other individual, because we're going to adapt in a unique way, very customized to ourselves based on all the things that we're going to talk about today. So that's something that you really want to make sure you keep in mind if you're a coach, if you're a physio, if you're an individual athlete, that your internal load is not the same with the external stressor, with the magnitude of that external stressor. This bullet point number 3 is we make lots of assumptions when we try and calculate internal loads. And we're going to talk about what those assumptions are, because quite frankly, the human system is very complex. We have the hormonal system, the cardiovascular system, the musculotendinous system, the connective tissue system. All of those systems interact to create the athlete experience and our ability to adapt to stressors. The goal is really just to navigate better. There's no perfect model. If there was a perfect model for understanding adaptation, everyone would use the same model. But if you look at other coaches in other sports or even within the sport of climbing, people aren't doing the exact same thing because there's not a perfect thing to do. There's just lots of options that we can do. So we're going to talk about those options today. So we want to think about long-term sustainability. And that was the original emphasis or genesis of this graph right here. If I can go back to the first one, this is how sustainable is your lifestyle? How sustainable is your exercise routine? How sustainable is your dietary choices? Those things are the primary considerations we need to have for our athletes or ourselves for long-term sustainability of a sport. Over on the right-hand side, another graphic that I made up here, this is all just types of external stress. And at the bottom right here, those are the things internally that we think about as being responsible for our adaptation to those external stressors, okay? And the external stressors, I just name them. You know, we can alter the work to rest ratio of an exercise. We can use smaller edge sizes if we want to be climbing specific. We can increase the movement velocity, which increases our power. We can increase the pitches that we climb in a day, etc. So all of those things are types of external load. However, we have different responses internally, right? So our goal over time, if we're new to training, if you're someone that's new to climbing and you're not used to the repetitive stress to your fingers, your capacity is the equivalent of this red umbrella down here. It's relatively low. Over time, what we want to do to be sustainable is we need to build a more robust system. We need to build capacity in our system to tolerate harder or more or greater external loads over time without ensuing a huge internal increase in that cost as well. That's what building capacity is all about. So this is kind of the highlight what we're going to talk about. We're going to go through the external stressors or loads. Those two terms could be used synonymously. And then we're going to go through individual components of internal loads. Okay, so this is a really important quote that I learned in school, and I don't exactly know who to accredit it to, but all models are wrong, but some models are useful, which means that there isn't a perfect model that we want to follow that's for sure do this model and we're never going to get injured. We want to make sure that we're flexible and we're more well-rounded about understanding different types of models. That's a better perspective to have for the individual or for our athletes or our patients. And I'm assuming that we have individual athletes, coaches, and physios on here too, is what I'm referring to in there. So these are the things that we can use to help understand individuals' response to load. Primary, number one, previous exposure. Like, what is the training history of the athlete? The training history of the individual defines or helps define for a coach what they could tolerate in a training session or in a training cycle. If we don't consider that as top priority, we really run into trouble with individuals because that is a prerequisite for doing higher intensity training like power training, high velocity training, campus board training, limit bouldering, etc. There's a metric that we can understand called the ACWR. And essentially this is understanding an athlete's fitness, and it's doing a calculation. It's doing the ratio of their total fitness in relation to the external load that we're going to put on them in another week. So we accumulate a knowledge base of how fit they are over a month's period of time, and then we make a week's worth of training, and then we can estimate whether they're going to be ready for that particular intervention. And this is very well accepted. This is Tim Gabbett's work. This stands for the acute chronic workload ratio. There's lots of information you can find about this metric, and it's really quite simple. All you do is you use the minutes of your session, so how long the duration was, and you multiply that by the intensity or the perceived intensity of the training session. If you're interested in more information on that, I have a 2-day course that I teach where we cover this in detail, and I'm sure there's other coaches talking about the ACWR, but if you're not familiar with that, look more into it. The second one right here is internal states. So other ways that we can assess internal load on an athlete is HRV. That stands for heart rate variability. RHR is your resting heart rate and just keeping track of your resting heart rate. HRR is your heart rate recovery, and then your hormonal profile, your sleep, and your dietary habits. Okay, there's slides on each of these. Why I'm not spending a lot of time, I'm just identifying what they are for you. External stressors, things that we don't really have as much control over as we would like. The training like that we've done in the past, right? Sometimes we wish we would have had more training. Sometimes our schedules don't allow that to happen. Environmental factors. Climbing is so environmental dependent that sometimes the weather's not good. Sometimes it's too cold. Sometimes it's too humid. Sometimes we don't have control over those external stressors, but they do have big implications for the amount of adaptation or increasing our injury risk. And the very last one is living space. And this has to do with kind of the psychology. And certainly right now, because of the coronavirus, people are kind of cramped up even more than they normally are. But there's some pretty compelling evidence to show that people in big cities don't respond the same to training interventions than people that live in a rural community, even if it's the same intervention. That's because the living space has an internal load on your body that influences your ability to adapt to your training program. And I think that's something that people, and that's why I was kind of interested in talking about this topic for this particular presentation, is people don't really think that all of the external stressors in your life influence your body's ability to adapt to your training program. If we don't account for those things, we really miss a huge component of someone's capacity or their limit to capacity based on how stressed they are. Biomechanics, anthropometrics, this is essentially how long your limbs are. Most climbers understand about ape index, how long your arms are in your width in relation to how tall you are. This also matters for the lower extremity. This also matters for the carrying angle at your elbows. This also for the quadriceps angle, etc. Those things matter. The storage of elastic energy, how good your skills are, rate of force development, etc. And then the very last one here is psychological profile. So what's the injury history of the athlete? How motivated is the athlete to train, and why are they motivated to train? And then the last one is intentions with training. Okay, and so I'm not gonna go through all these right now because we have slides on each of them. The one thing that I want everyone to understand though is stress is neither good nor bad. Stress is just some type of dosage that if applied at an appropriate level, our body should adapt to, right? But stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. Stress is necessary to get stronger. Stress is necessary to make the skin on my fingertips grow more dense so I can hold on to smaller holds, and like all of you. So stress isn't always a bad thing. Stress at an inappropriate dosage is dangerous. And that's why we want to get a better understanding of how our bodies are responding to different types of stressors, because they accumulate and they make our life, either adaptable, sustainable, right, or unsustainable. So these two terms, eustressor, good stressors, and then distressors, maladaptation or bad stressors. The next slide, it brings up a principle, the principle of hormesis, and this is all about dosage. And likely if people have taken courses from me before, have heard me say that there is no perfect finger training program. There is no best finger training program. There is no best climbing program. There is no best finger board, etc. Right? All of those things are pretty irrelevant. They're much less important than the actual loads and the dosage that we apply of whatever stimulus that we're trying to get out of those particular interventions, whether it be finger training, bouldering on a certain board, doing a certain exercise for the lower extremity, whether it be deadlifting or squatting, etc. It's all about dosage, okay? So hormesis it would say that low doses of training induce an adaptive benefit. And that's a good thing. That's the good stress that we want, that that we essentially wake up every morning and we really enjoy doing, going to the gym and trying hard. As long as the dosage is low enough, our bodies should respond to that stimulus. And as a response, they should get better at doing that stimulus, right? Next bullet point right here, high doses of training, high doses of anything pose a risk. High doses of drinking water, you can drink too much water. You can become hyponatremic, right? You can use your screen too much, right? Athletes can train their fingers way too much. You can climb too much. So increased dosage of anything is detrimental to the organism as a whole and reduces the entire organism's adaptive capacity. So if we have a goal to do, the hardest route of our life, and we're spending a lot of time not worrying about sleep, and we're staying up too late, playing on the phone or playing video games, or whatever it is you're doing at night, that's reducing your capacity for sustaining or fulfilling that goal, right? Those things we want to always keep in mind. So in general, we can assume that, we can say that the major health benefits of exercise in general, and I would say exercise, we could change this to strength training, because I think strength training, in general, climbers are all really good and too good at doing exercise. We generally do too much exercise, in my opinion. So when we talk about strength training, though, like, these are the things that have been shown to be beneficial through the literature on hormesis with strength training and exercise. Upregulate antioxidant defense. So it makes our immune system more defensive. It makes it more robust. It allows us to get sick less. It allows us to, if we have toxic molecules in our body, it allows us to fight them off better. Mitochondrial biogenesis. This is essentially increasing the efficiency, increasing the utilization and the actual content of the powerhouse of the cells, which are the mitochondria. So if we're a sport climber and we're trying to send our hardest route, absolutely we want to increase the mitochondrial biogenesis of the forearm flexors, right? That's a good thing. That means we have more sustainability of our route that we're trying to climb. Improving muscle health. This has to do with certainly the mitochondrial biogenesis, but also the blood flow. We increase the capillary density to muscle. We increase the neural recruitment, which means we use a larger percentage of our muscle mass. We help coordinate muscles across joints, help stabilize joints, etc. And then this next point, preventing injuries. So injury prevention, and this is a topic that I think is really important to cover on here, because I talk trash a lot on the term prehab. And I put this down here on the bottom right. If you can look at my graph, I'll zoom in right here. So if we use this term prehab, and we make the assumption that some sort of exercise is going to indefinitely reduce our injury risk, that defies the principle of hormesis. Because at some point of doing that rehabilitation, you're going to no longer gain any sort of benefit from doing it, because the dosage is too great. So therefore, you're wasting your time beyond a certain point. What that point is harder to identify. And if you've used a rehabilitation strategy in the past and it's been effective for you and your symptoms have gone down, etc., that's great. That's the whole point of doing it. However, you cannot continue to do that and continue to sustain a benefit from it. Okay, so that's all about dosage as well, right? And I wanted to make sure I highlighted that with this presentation, because that's one thing that I do talk a lot about on my social channels. And then last, everything has a threshold. Another graph, things that I would say here, you've been looking at the images already. Everything at too high of dosage becomes toxic. Finger training, limit bouldering, campus boarding, prehab, water, sleep, screen time, work, etc. Okay, we said all those. Oh, let me slide over. Okay, external loads. So these are the things that we can manage more easily. These are the things that we're good at manipulating. Climbers and coaches and people that like to work out are really good at understanding the external loads and the potential influence they have on the body. But remember, we're always making lots of assumptions with external loads. We are making the assumption that by using this particular load, we are going to get this particular adaptation. So when it comes to the concept of periodization, it's all about making assumptions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We've been doing it for a long time and it's actually worked pretty effectively. However, athletes have always been injured as well. So we don't have it perfect, right? There is no perfect model like we've already mentioned, but we're going to use those assumptions. So some of the things that we'll talk about for external load is percentages of 1 rep max. And everyone knows what that is. If I have a maximum weight that I can lift, I'm going to use a percentage of that to train whatever it is that I'm trying to train. If I'm trying to train absolute strength, I'm going to use above 85% or at 85%. If I'm going to try and train power endurance or strength endurance, I would use 60 to 80%. If I'm going to train endurance, I would maybe train 50 to 60%. And there's all sorts of flexible, barriers to that. And that's very individual dependent, but you get the point. Percentage of intent. How hard is the athlete trying for every repetition? This is when having more nuanced measuring tools like velocity-based training tools can be really valuable, because how hard an athlete's trying with every repetition dictates the internal load and the outcome. That's really hard to make an assessment on if you're a coach. If you're an individual even, that's really hard to make an assessment on. So that's something else that is very popular now. Percentage of possible repetitions or repetitions in reserve is another well-accepted way to manage external load. That's essentially exercising someone in proximity to failure in terms of repetitions. How many reps can they do until they're failing? And then we're going to stay maybe 3 to 5 reps prior to them failing, depending on the goal of the coach or the athlete. Overall, the overall time of the contraction, how long or how sustained is the muscle contraction? The distance that we're moving is a type of external load. If we're using climbing examples, the number of clips that you do. Let's say you're doing multiple routes in the gym and you're counting clips. That's a way to quantify the distance that you've traveled. That's an external load. The number of hand moves, that's another way to count it, maybe a bit more cumbersome if you're in the gym. Distance could be jumping, could be running, could be bar movement, etc. And then the last one, speed of movement and power output. So this darkened portion down here is incredibly valuable for people to remember, that how much you've done in the past should help predict what you can do in the future. So if you're someone that's relatively new to finger training and you've done very little finger training in the past, you should not expect to get really strong fingers in the near future, because it's not reasonable. It's too much of a dosage, and your system does not have the capacity to tolerate that much of a dosage. You're going to get hurt. Really simple to think about it in that regard. Okay. So over here let me show you these graphs up here. Let me describe these for you. There's some interesting points. So adaptation to the same exercise. So you can see here the exercise stimulus, this is what we do. We just slowly increase the stimulus over time. We're going to get more adaptation at the beginning, but at some point I'm going to plateau and I'm going to reach the maximum stimulus, or the maximum adaptation for that particular training load, and it's going to taper off. One thing that's really important to remember, if you're someone that has a good training age, which means you've been climbing a long time, you've been training a long time, as the training age of the athlete increases, the potency of that exercise decreases. So I wouldn't expect huge gains in strength, huge improvements in load or velocity. Well, probably velocity, because people don't train that very much in climbing, but certainly not load. We're not going to see a dramatic increase in load in someone's fingers that's been climbing for 20 years at the high level of our sport, right? So as athletes get a better training age, they probably don't need to spend so much time trying to increase that load. We want to think long-term sustainability in those athletes, right? Because there is a finite limit to how much capacity we can have. This this graph on the bottom, I'm sorry, I put my water bottle and I put it in the other room. So let's assume that this athlete is training at 75%. And this right here is just over the load over time. And the load is getting greater over time. So their 70% load is increasing over, let's say, a month's worth of time. So you can see originally here, there's a dip in this other blue or purple color. I actually am colorblind, for people that have taken courses from me. know that maybe. So if you see random colors on these graphs, it's because I know they're different, but I don't really know what color they are. So you can see a deficit right here, which shows that this is a stress, right? This is a stress from going to 100 to 150, and these numbers are arbitrary, but you get the point. There's a deficit, but the athlete adapts to that stressor. Now that individual is increasing their load, but I can increase someone's work capacity if the internal stressor doesn't continue to go down. So that's what capacity building is all about. Applying a stressor and adapting to that stressor, and then increasing that stressor over time without a dramatic change internally, right? That's how we can build capacity without getting injured. And hopefully you've gotten the theme already. That simply takes time. There's no way to speed that up. So we want to be really patient as coaches and athletes with how fast we're getting strong, how good we're getting at the sport. Those things absolutely take time. And if we're not patient with them, we're going to get injured. Okay, so the first internal load that we're going to talk about is heart rate. So I'm assuming that some of you already measure your heart rate on a regular basis. The one that's very popular to measure is heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is a really good metric to keep track of. But remember, it's just a single metric. It doesn't give us all the answers that we're looking for, neither does the heart rate. But we can assume that heart rate measures the metabolic demand. As my heart rate increases with an exercise, my metabolism is becoming more stressed. I'm working harder, right? Could be as simple as that, right? It really reflects the magnitude of the individual stressor, whatever it is. If you're sprinting, if you're hiking, if you're doing limit bouldering repeaters, right? You're doing even high volume power training, doing pull-ups. I was testing Alex, or I was training with Alex yesterday in my office, and we were doing deadlifts for velocity. We were doing pull-ups for velocity, and then we were doing overcoming repeaters. And after every set, because we were doing a good amount of reps, increased respiratory demand. If we were to check the heart rate would have been increasing. That's expected. That's a good thing to understand. If we think about the Borg scale, a lot of people know what the ratings of perceived exertion really mean. And that RPE, if you've ever heard that, and it usually, there's a bunch of different scales, but the Borg scale is probably the most accepted one to use. And it goes from 7 to 20. So if we can look at the steps right here, it starts at 7, goes all the way up to 20. The Borg scale was created with the intention of trying to estimate someone's percentage VO2 maximum. So your VO2 maximum is like the absolute amount of oxygen your body can utilize, the volume, before it starts going anaerobic at a really fast pace, right? So essentially, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, it really means you're working super, super hard. Beyond your VO2 maximum, you're not going to be able to sustain the exercise very long, okay? But the Borg scale was created with the intention of using your heart rate and estimating your VO2 maximum. So we can use the Borg scale with your RPE and your heart rate to get this average of your workout intensity, and that actually works very well. So bullet point number 4 on the left here, the lower percentage of your VO2 maximum that you're using, the reduced metabolic cost. So if I'm only working at 30 or 40% of my VO2 max, I'm going to be able to sustain that exercise for a longer duration. If I'm working at 80% of my VO2 max, 90% of my VO2 max, I'm not going to be able to sustain that activity. So if we can get in the habit of tracking our heart rate, or in the context of working really high intensity anaerobic, our recovery, right, our heart rate recovery, how fast it goes back down to the starting position, we can get a better idea of the internal load of our training, sessions, right? And if we do that one day, it doesn't really mean a lot. If we do that over a week, maybe going to get some ideas. If we do that over a whole training year, we're going to get a really good idea of what we can tolerate, what maybe produces continued gains in the sport, and what leads to us getting really fatigued and injured. Okay, this bullet point right here, using the same warm-up, is an incredibly valuable tool that I suggest all my clients do. So if I use the exact same warm-up every single day, and you can define your own warm-up. whatever you need to do to make sure you feel ready for climbing is totally appropriate. And if you feel 100% ready to get on the wall, that's a good enough warm up for you. If you use the same thing every day and you use your heart rate, and you can use the RPE scale to estimate how hard it feels on any given day, then you can also calculate your heart rate. And if you keep track of both of those things, it gives you a better understanding of how prepared you are to train on any given day. And if your heart rate is really high and you don't feel very good and you feel like you're working extra hard, then you're probably not in a position to do the highest level velocity or highest power output training on that given day, because you have a level of fatigue that's probably not worth risking training under. Okay, so if we have an increased heart rate here, we get arousal, stress, fatigue, maybe dehydration. I should say dehydration, sorry. We see a decreased heart rate with our normal auto-regulated warm-up. We see potential adaptation to training. We see capacity building. We see recovery. We see fitness, right? That's a great thing. If I can track it over a training cycle and my warm-up, my heart rate is staying the same or going lower, that means I'm being more efficient with the movements. That means my body's adapting to the stress appropriately. Okay. And then this last point down here in bold, variability is a very good thing. So variability in your heart rate is health promoting. With exercise, the heart rate should increase. But as soon as exercise is over, my heart rate should go back down. If my heart rate doesn't go back down, it just keeps climbing, that means there's potentially other stressors in my life that continue to keep my system ramped up, my metabolism ramped up, and that's risky. That's increasing the dosage of the exercise of whatever it is that I'm doing, okay? And let me show you a couple things on this graph, and then I think there's some questions, and I'll stop for a second and see. But I'll probably wait till the end just so we can get through most of these. So on the x-axis here is exercise intensity, and on the left-hand side is percentage VO2 max. But there's a linear relationship between the intensity of the exercise via the Borg scale and your heart rate. The way that you calculate your heart rate maximum is 220 minus your age. So if you take that number minus your age, that's your maximum heart rate. And that's not a set number, that's very individual, but you can use it as a roundabout. So if I take my RPE for my session and my heart rate, I can get and I divide that by my maximum, I get my average for that session. So what we really care about is it changing over time? Are my sessions becoming easier or less demanding as I increase the load? That's what builds capacity. And on the top right-hand side here, I have in highlighted here, heart rate recovery matters more when it comes to things 17 to 20. This red, green, whatever color that is, we care more about not necessarily your heart rate, but how quickly your heart rate returns to a resting position so you can do that same exercise again. Because when it comes to bouldering, someone that's a competitive boulderer, you have 4 minutes in a chair or 5 minutes in a chair, and your resting heart rate better come back down, right? Before you get back on the wall. So we can train with that in mind, and we can do all sorts of different interventions to make sure that we're recovering quickly. And that's one way that we can get an estimate. Okay, the next one is hormones. So we won't talk too much about this for the sake of time, but really what you want to understand is that hormones have both acute and chronic influences. There's always this balance, this catabolic, which is breaking tissues down, and the anabolic, which is building things back up. The one thing that works really good for like making sure we get a good anabolic balance is making sure the dosage of our sessions is short. Then we get less catabolic breakdown. If we have really long sessions and lots of muscle pump, lots of fatigue, those sessions tend to be much harder to recover from. So if we simply try and avoid those sessions, in general, we're going to have a greater anabolic response and less catabolism. Large stress, large response. This is certainly true with new types of exercise. So if you're someone that's new to an exercise intervention and you do deadlifting for the first time and you do 4 sets of 10, deadlifting at 70%, you're going to be sore as hell the next day. That doesn't necessarily mean that deadlifting is a bad exercise. It just means that you're getting a large response because you're not accustomed to that stress. So we're going to get a big hormonal response as a consequence of that. These are some of the hormones that you'll always hear about: growth hormone, norepinephrine, cortisol. Those are the stress hormones. Those are good because they mobilize your energy. Down here, these help in building. So IGF-1, growth hormone, cortisol, those are the building molecules. But it's really hard. This is the important part, in my opinion. It's hard to be actionable with hormones. Unless you're getting blood work done on a regular basis, which very few climbers do. Maybe, I don't know of anyone in the States that does this regularly. I know overseas some people do this, but it's hard to be actionable with hormones unless you're getting your blood drawn all the time. So in general, we want to think about things that drive, like the response is going to be the intensity of the exercise, the volume, how much recovery we have. Nutrition is actually the fastest way to recover. Nutrition and rest, without question, are the fastest ways to recover. So when I do double sessions of training, I will do a training session in the morning, then I will make sure I get adequate nutrition between those sessions, carbs and protein and water for the most part, and some other molecules. Then later in the evening, I'll do another training session, right? Rest and nutrition, really important. Let's see what else I want to say about this. Those we've kind of already said. Let's see, we've already talked about that. I do want to mention weight cutting though. Weight cutting is a really unique strategy for any sport that has a work that's like has relative strength based on your body weight, and it's really effective. However, it's not sustainable because the stressor is too great, right? Even if the numbers are going up and the performance is improving and the individual is showing other internal signs of stress, that's not a sustainable strategy long-term. But I'm a fan of doing weight cuts, but I'll do them periodically. I'll do 2 per year, maybe, right? 1 in the fall and 1 in the spring. But it's definitely not a sustainable strategy. So if you have athletes that are interested in that, or or if you're interested in that, make sure you really become educated about how you can do that effectively, because it can be done, but it's definitely something to consider as an internal stress. This image on the right-hand side is showing you, which I think is a great graphic, just showing sympathetic type of overtraining, which is very high intensity stress, which would happen with these types of interventions: limit bouldering, project bouldering, climbing. Then there's also parasympathetic overtraining, which is aerobic in nature. And this is projecting, big wall climbing, running, alpine climbing, and then other endurance types of sports, right? But all of these have a metabolic cost, right? So everything you do has a metabolic cost. Make sure that what you're doing is sustainable. If you like to do multiple of these things, you do multiple disciplines, that's much harder to pull off than just doing one discipline. And like Eli mentioned in my introduction, I went from doing big wall trad climbing, which I love the adventure of, to just doing bouldering, right? And I still miss big wall trad climbing, but if I really want to see how productive or how strong or how good I can be at bouldering, I can't really afford with my schedule the cost of those other interventions. The cost is too great for me, so it's probably not worth my time. Okay, force depression. This is another internal metric that we can utilize, and this is all about day-to-day, like in the gym, testing someone and noting that their force is going down, right? The one thing that you want to consider with exercise is our multi-joint, which means we're using movement. Every single muscle has their own recovery process. They have their own recovery time frame. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Type 1 fibers. So who the hell knows, right? So we want to use force depression as a way to assume that the athlete is fatigued in pattern, so we can make training intervention changes on the daily so we can reduce injury risk. What we use to assess, like usually talk about, or my courses are about, velocity drops, jump height or changes in jump height. MVIC stands for changes, or in this case, changes in maximum voluntary isometric contraction. So that's force. This next bullet point I think is really cool. Like, how many of you coaches have an upper and a lower body test? I usually suggest people do jumping for the lower body, and then I suggest people do now velocity or MVIC pulls for the upper extremity, because they're different muscle groups. They're going to have a different recovery strategy, and they're going to have a different adaptive capacity. So having both of those makes sense. Progression does not always or necessarily equal adaptation. This is something that we really miss a lot in rock climbing when we think about finger training. It's easy to make your finger numbers go up. It's harder to actually see that straight directly transfer to improving your rock climbing ability, right? That doesn't mean that it's not useful. It just means that it's not a direct reflection of the internal response of our system. Because in some instances, it's not the same thing. It's not the same intensity. It's not the same velocity. It's not the same time under tension, right? It could be argued that they're different interventions, but in general, even if an athlete's numbers are getting greater with any exercise, capacity repeats on a bouldering wall, deadlifting from the floor, bench pressing, etc., it does not guarantee that their internal system is adapting and recovering in a long pace or in pace with that external load. So we always want to be cautious about that. We make lots of assumptions in that regard all the time. And it's really easy to fall into that trap. I've done it myself and I still do. It's really hard not to. Okay. We've already talked about this. There isn't a perfect model. Everyone would use it. This graphic here is the rep velocity relationship, essentially showing you that as we do more repetitions, our velocity goes down. So if we want to try and target a specific function of someone's strength or type of strength, we can do so by measuring their velocity and understanding that as they get more tired, their movement speed and velocity is going to go down. That's one of the really cool things about velocity-based training. But this is very specific to the individual. That's very specific to the individual's training history. That's very specific to the individual's genetics, as well as what they really enjoy doing, the intention of the athlete, okay? As well as specific to the load. Okay, so the psychological part, I will go through this one the fastest because I'm not sure if they have a psychologist in this series. I imagine that they would. So in terms of psychology, what I want to highlight here is the psychological profile of the athlete affects the sustainability of their training. And this, I talk to patients all day long that have pain. Things in your life that create stress can influence and increase the sensitivity of any pain complaint. That's because psychological stress and biological stress are very tightly connected. It's very hard to tell them apart from a clinician, someone sitting in front of you. So we really want to think about this with our training, right? We have this appraisal process, and I stole this graphic off Wikipedia that you can look through. If it's something that's double positive, then the athlete's going to be excited about doing it. Those are the things that we want to spend more time doing, right? If you're a coach and you're determined that your athlete needs to get better at this, and they hate doing this, whatever it is, they're probably not going to get that good at it. That's the hard reality, because they're not going to want to do it. They're not going to put that much intention into it. They're not going to give a damn about doing it on their days off, right? So if it's something that's double negative, right, they're not going to enjoy doing it. They're not going to do it, right? So we always want to make sure that we're thinking about this with the interventions that we give to people or that we use for ourselves, because the appraisal dictates the cost, right? If there's a negative appraisal of any intervention, it becomes more costly to the individual system. If I give someone an increased cost to their exercise on top of their already, fully filled glass of capacity, I'm going to push them over the top, and that's not sustainable. They're probably going to get injured, okay? Versus this concept of flow state, when people have fun doing something. In some instances, training is not the answer. Having more fun in climbing and pushing yourself on the wall could be a better solution, because individuals don't have this hypersensitive focus on numbers and metrics and all of these things, and they can just really be in this flow state. Okay, so this is a lifestyle influence research paper, and I just broke it down for you. And what they did is they took 3 different groups of people, and then the one group had really no stress, the second group had a moderate amount of stress, and the third group had a really high amount of stress. And they did the same exercise. What they found is the individuals that had the lowest amount of stress, they're the only ones that adapted. The people that had moderate amounts of stress, all they did was recover. So they just went back to baseline. The individuals that had a lot of stress, they went into a deficit, into an energy deficit, into a hormonal catabolic deficit, right? Into a heart rate increase and stress response deficit, right? Those athletes are at risk of getting injured. So I put down here, like, you can't do it all. Even though we love exercising and even though we love being outside and doing all these sports, we can't fit it all in. And if we always try to fit it all in and fit more and more and more in, we're going to run into a problem, right? The cost is too great. We're not going to be able to adapt, and we're going to, you know, essentially redline. And then you can look at that slide. I think we already talked about that. And then I have a couple more slides, 2 more slides, and then we'll do questions. So biomechanics, super important. And biomechanics we'll spend some more time talking about, because this is something that I think is really good for people to hear. So movement, every movement has a neural load or a neural cost with it. Some movements are more costly than other movements. For people that have taken courses from mine, an eccentric movement, a full isotonic movement, I'm sorry, is more expensive than an isometric movement. That doesn't mean one's better than the other. It just means they have their own unique costs, right? If you're going to do a limit bouldering project or limit bouldering moves, that has a defined cost compared to red point sport climb, right? So like, but the actual neural load doesn't necessarily reflect the force. So, and that essentially means, like, if I have 2 people doing the same exact movement, even though they're doing the same movement, it doesn't reflect the force that they're producing, but it also doesn't reflect the neural load that it's putting on the individual, right? More skilled athletes have less noise. And by less noise, if we measure movement skill with like an EMG, a needle EMG where they stick needles in your muscles in a research setting, the people with better skills use less energy. This is an incredible like boost to people spending more time on the climbing wall and getting really good at their skills climbing. Because if I'm training an athlete and their skills for the sport are improving, they're saving energy in a lot of different ways, right? So they have less cost, they have more efficiency. When we talk about unstable training, and this is really popular, people love using gymnastic rings, people love using TRX bands. This does not mean that those aren't helpful. What it does mean, though, is they have a lot of EMG noise. If we measure those athletes with the same EMG, the needles in their muscles, we see that there's a lot of activity, which means that because the exercise is so novel, it's very costly from an energy perspective. But remember, just because it's costly from an energy perspective does not mean that it's like producing more force, right? So this is something that I think people spend a lot of time doing body weight types of interventions with unstable surfaces, just doing mad reps all the time. Really, you're just spinning in the mud. If you keep doing that too long, forever, that's enough of a dosage that you've adapted to the exercise. You're not getting any additional benefit out of it. It doesn't mean that you can't come back to it at some other time. It just means that at that particular moment in time, you're probably better moving on, okay? People with better mechanics have free energy, and that's what these 2 graphs are over here. This is really cool when we look at like different athletes from all sports. Better athletes move the least. So if you've ever done a climb and you've been working on a climb for a long time and you just flow through it and you're like, oh my gosh, how did that happen? That's because that was an optimal neural strategy for you where you actually moved the least. And everyone knows this when they do bouldering. They go outside and they do a hard boulder and they can't even do the move. And then all of a sudden they can do multiple moves in a row, right? Essentially, that's learning to move less by learning more efficiency, okay? And that more efficiency comes from better muscle coordination, better rate of force development, better tendon stiffness, all of those things. So efficiency increases your adaptive capacity. If I can do the same move or the same set of moves with more efficiency, I can do more of them in a row, or I can do more attempts at that couple moves, whatever it is. So by moving better, by climbing better, by improving my skills, I'm improving my capacity for whatever it is I'm training for, bouldering, sport climbing, trad climbing. The downside with that, though, remember there's always a downside, is if I'm just doing that all the time, I could potentially increase in an injury risk as well, because that's a really high dosage, especially if it's in one particular session. So even climbing, can be too much of a dosage. And everyone knows that, right? And the example I give for people, I always ask in my finger course is how many people think that professional athletes don't get finger injuries? And everyone's like, no, they definitely do. Well, why? Obviously they do, right? They're really good at the sport and they're really efficient, but they can't sustain that much dosage over a long period of time. They have to take time off as well. Okay, so reason that we get really efficient with movement: organization from the central nervous system, which is the brain down the spinal cord; control or rate coding from the peripheral nervous system, how fast the signal goes out to my muscle, how quick I release calcium, all the machinery, how quick that is. And then at the tissue level, how much energy can I store in my elbow flexors? How much energy can I store in my lats and my pecs? How much energy can I store in my finger flexors for power output? That's what I'm referring to here when I say SSC. That stands for the stretch shortening cycle. So up here in this graph, and people that have taken my course have seen this, but I drew one out because I was, for some reason, wanting to spend a lot of time drawing. And the athlete on the top is less efficient and they're less powerful. So what we see here is we can see zero force right here. This horizontal line is just zero force, the black line. And you can see this dip right here. This is an eccentric load. So they go into a negative load. And this is an example of someone jumping. So if someone was standing on the ground and they did a quick drop and then they jumped up as high as they could, they actually go into the negative because that's them loading their muscles eccentrically, which takes load off their body. They actually drop into position. Then this isometric force, this rate of force development, defines how quickly they get through the full range of motion. You can see that on the athlete on the bottom right here, this bottom graph, there's a bigger eccentric drop because this athlete can dip faster. Then that athlete has a much shorter isometric phase. They can be more snappy. And that's a bit maybe complicated for this talk today. But if people are interested in more of that, you can contact me about that. But really all this is showing is that the athlete that takes more time to get through the movement is using more energy. The cost is greater for the athlete that has less movement economy and less movement efficiency, is really all this is trying to show you. So more force, less time, less cost overall, okay? Especially if they're going through the isometric force, rate of force development very quick, and they're storing a lot of that energy in their connective tissues. And then the last slide right here is what the hell are we going to do with all this information, right? How do we apply this information? So we've covered quite a few things, and I'll maybe browse through and give you a quick overview of what we covered. But essentially what we want to understand is that the adaptive cost of exercise is system specific. And when I say system, I mean finger training, pulling training, deadlift training, climbing training, running if you like training. All of those things have a cost that's very specific to that intervention. So the example that I gave over here was adaptive specificity for finger training. So you can see here, there's maximum session stress. The one with the highest stress is absolutely the finger flexors because that's the target of that particular intervention. But even though I'm training my fingers, I'm still imposing a cost to my elbow flexors. I'm still imposing a cost to my abdominal muscles and my upper body. I'm still imposing a cost to my central nervous system and my peripheral nervous system. And I'm also imposing a cost to my heart and my lungs. So we can't think so isolated about the cost of our exercise and making the assumption that we can just add more onto our plates. That's really risky, and that's a really good way to get injured, okay? So down here in bold, even finger training by itself has a cost to the system. Now consider that cost in addition to your entire training session. I get lots of questions from people about, when should I train my fingers? Should I train my fingers after my climbing session or before my climbing session? I would say if you're really trying to apply finger training, unless you're doing a couple very brief activation pulls or hangs, there's no reason to do it in proximity to your training session. Do it at a separate time of the day. It's going to be less costly of a dosage of your training session, okay? So I don't want to get off on a tangent on that, but risks are associated with multi-systems or sport training. There's a greater cost. If you want to boulder, if you want to sport climb, if you want to ski in the winter, if you want to ride your bike, all of those things equate to this large cost to your entire system. If we forget about the entire system and we only focus on one of the subspecialties of the sports, we're at an increased risk of getting injured because the hormonal system is going to be stressed. The heart's going to be stressed, right? The central nervous system stressed. All of those things are affected. We need more calories. We haven't talked much about feeding, but if I do more sports and I do multiple things in a day, I need more calories. It's really quite hard to understand how many calories you need for your life on top of your exercise, because the metrics that we use to equate those are not that accurate. So it's really easy to overfeed or underfeed if we're doing too much. If we get into a regular habit of training and we consume similar amounts of calories, it's much more easy to understand when we need more and we need less. That's a sustainable programming cycle long term. Okay, so we've also talked about how tests are not direct indicators. Tests are assumptions that we make, right? And some of the tests are 1 rep max, velocity, heart rate variability, heart rate recovery, right? All of those things are assessment tools, but they're making a lot of assumptions. So increasing number, even though we're increasing the number of our loads, we might be reducing the health of the system because it could be more costly than it's worth. I put off season here with a question mark, is climbing's hard to take an off season on because we can either travel or we can go to gyms or we have places at our house, right? It's hard to take an off season, but that's really important. That's really valuable, I think. And when I say off season, I don't mean stop doing anything during the season. I would suggest people still put a load to their finger flexors, but not training. Off season from training, I think, is really valuable. Off season from climbing, I think, is really valuable. This is when doing another sport for a couple weeks makes a lot of sense. Function could drop before indicated. That's why the tests aren't precise as we would like them. We could have an athlete that's still improving on their tests, but their function is reducing. And we've talked about that with the individual when we're talking about weight cutting. It's easy to lose weight, hard to sustain that, because even though the performance is improving, it's really hard to know the internal stress that's going on. So how do we track this balance long term? Loading history. We want to make sure that we keep track of this. Keep track of the things you do. Keep track of a journal log, dietary log. Use some sort of app that you can keep track of your calories and your macronutrients. If you don't know jack about nutrition, find someone that knows jack about nutrition. Contact Gnarly. I'm sure they have a nutritionist that can teach you all about nutrition. Keep track of your ACWR, right? Which is your how fit you are in relation to how much stress you're imposing on your system. Use that for your clients. Performance measures. Is the athlete getting better at the sport? Are you sending? Are you doing what you're supposed to be doing outside? That's what you're training for in the first place. If you're not, it's not that you have a bad training program per se. It could be that you're doing too much. Your system is in overdrive and you're not recovering, or you're not adapting. You're only recovering. If I'm only recovering, I'm not getting better. I'm only getting back to my baseline, right? We can use performance as a way to track what we're doing with our training cycles. And then VBT I put down here is one that I like to use. And then internal metrics that we've talked about, nutritional loading, and then external metrics, surveys, questionnaires, food logs, basic physio, etc. Okay, so we are 10 minutes over, which is actually pretty good for me. So thank you for your time. Let me pull this last slide up. Okay, so for those of you that have taken courses from me, you know that I go through things pretty fast, but that's why there's a good amount of content on the slides for you so you can review that, and apparently you can listen to this again if you want. But if you're interested in other courses, this is how you can access other courses on my website store. Currently, I think I have a tendon rehabilitation course this Saturday, and then a velocity-based training course next Saturday, and then the following Saturday will be a low back pain and pain science course. And then for people that are interested in the majority of how I make money in my life is by being a physician, either in my office or doing remote consultations from around the world. So there's a link for that as well. So let me bring Eli back on, and then let me see what kind of questions everyone has. See if we can answer some.
Tyler, I can help you manage the questions if you want.
Sweet, shoot.
You have access to them, but a couple of things really quick is if you want to give us this PowerPoint, we can send this in the email tomorrow
Oh, cool. Yeah,
with
that's
the
fine.
recording, along with all of your contact information and your website as well. So
Cool.
people will have all of that right in their inbox. It'll be super easy for them to get
Yeah,
to.
cool, man. I'm happy to do that for sure.
Cool. So if you want to try to answer some of these questions, some of them kind of overlap. I'll try to do my best to communicate them accurately. I think the first one, and this has been asked in a couple of different variations, but I'll use this one. Can you reiterate how to monitor HRV over time to assess fatigue and readiness for training? And then how does something like the Whoop strap or another, device actually measure this? And are they accurate? Do they help? What are your thoughts around those devices?
The Whoop strap is great, and it for sure. So the heart rate variability is all about, like, when you're exercising, your heart rate should go up, but as soon as you're done exercising, your heart rate should go back down. So essentially, that's a glimpse into your system's stress and, like, digest is the other term we use. That's commonly used for it, systems and how they balance each other out. So I should get stressed with loading and feeding for that matter, but I should be less stressed when I'm not exercising. So heart rate variability, even though the heart beats us, let's say 60 beats per minute, just to make it simple, those beats aren't the same distance apart. So it measures the distance of those beats to give you the variability of either how hard your heart is working or how your heart is going back to baseline. So heart rate variability, you can just, with any of those trackers, phone apps, Whoop, etc., they'll give you the graphs of, heart rate variability is good. If we reduce our heart rate variability, our system is stressed. So if we go into a training session and our heart rate variability is consistently high, our system's probably really stressed. And that's the whole system. Which part of the system, who the hell knows? Likely the endocrine system is stressed, the hormonal system stressed, which is the endocrine system, the cardiovascular system stressed. Maybe you're not feeding enough. Like, there's lots of things that we can look back on as a consequence of HRV. But if our HRV is consistently high, it shows that we're probably doing too much and we're not recovering at its simplest.
Good. Is there the question that's asked, is there an ideal percentage of intent? Should we always aim for 100% intent? I think what they're asking, right, is should we always be going 100%, or where?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to with, like, speed with velocity, so I would say when you're climbing, no, because the skills of climbing always don't require us to move with weights. Hell yeah, all of your movement should be with intent. There's no reason to lift something slow unless it's awfully slow because it's super heavy. But even if you're lifting really heavy, you should try and move it as fast as you possibly can, because you're going to get more force. Because if I measure someone's velocity at, like, let's say we're deadlifting 300 pounds, and they measure velocity at like 0.3 meters per second, and then the next lift is 0.25 meters per second, then the next lift is 0.24 meters per second, the 0.3 meters per second repetition produced more force. So if the goal with training is to produce more force, you absolutely want the intent to be there with those exercises. But with finger training, depends on the intervention, probably not. Climbing, probably not, unless you're doing limit bouldering.
This is a little trickier one. How do you handle actual state versus perceived state? IG, feeling fatigue, but high performance, versus feeling fine, but shitty performance. And then kind of building on that, how warmed up or far into a session before you can make a judgment?
I would say after, like, that's when that consistency of the warm up works very well, to make sure that, and it really requires a lot of time and a lot of being honest with yourself. But absolutely, there's always those instances where you do feel bad and you do send. And so it's never going to be a perfect model, and there's no perfect answer for that. But I would say we take multiple things and we utilize multiple things to make the best guess that we can, but there's lots of assumptions. For me, my warm-up takes me 35 minutes. And I know because I do the same thing all the time, but I always end it with some sort of max force test and now some sort of velocity-based movement to also add on top of that. Then you can look at my calories. Like, I'm super lame with my diet. Like, I eat the same thing all day, every day. And that's for me because I just want to get fueled and I want to know that I'm getting enough, and I don't want to spend time making food. And it keeps it regular for me, where I know for me, it's usually not my caloric load because it doesn't change that much. And my actual exercise habits don't change very much. But for people that have lots of variation there, that's when using, you have to look back at your diet. Are you carb loaded? Are you carb depleted? Are you hydrated enough between burns? Are you resting enough between burns? There's so many factors that really play into it. I would say, if you're trying to just base it on your perception, you want to make sure that you have something physical on top of that perception to kind of balance it with, in addition to maybe something internal, heart rate variability, or just heart rate during your warm up or after your warm up. You could warm up and measure your heart rate, or you can measure your heart rate halfway through, measure your heart rate at the end, and track that on a regular basis and see how it changes. That would work.
Good. I think building kind of off of that, Max asks, for those of us who are self-coached, is there a way that you would recommend tracking our warm-up, our workouts, etc., as related to improving our capacity or adaptation in a given area, e.g., working on improving endurance for long routes?
So read that one more time. I'm sorry.
So just for those of us that are coached, how would you recommend tracking our warm-up and workouts related to improving our capacity or adaptation? What is the thing that they would track?
So if you're trying to just track it on yourself and you're trying to understand, like, capacity is distance with the same intensity or more intensity, I'm sorry, assuming that the internal load's the same. So it's really hard to track that other than if you have some sort of fixed board, like a moon board, tension board, spray wall that never changes, campus board with feet on, and finding a way to test yourself and then retest yourself at the same intensity and note an improvement. But the trick is you can't have something that changes all the time, like a climbing gym wall, because it's so different. Every movement is so different, and the efficiency of that movement is so different that it needs to be as simple and as identical as it was the time before. So I would say a campus board in most instances is probably the best. Doing ladders on a campus board. If you do a test on yourself, how many ladders can you do on the big rung until you're failing? Do the middle rung, rest 5 minutes, do the middle rung. Do the same thing, rest 5 minutes, do the small rung. Do your training intervention, see how many you can do in a couple weeks from now. Is your capacity increasing at the same intensity? It's hard to understand intensity and capacity if we're changing the intensity, which is a tricky thing when it comes to like lifting weights and adding load all the time. That's one way to do it. I think that would work good, kind of basic way.
Yeah, hopefully that gives Max some guidance.
Max, send me a message if you have a question too.
Are you familiar with Franco? And I can't say his name. It sounds like an Italian guy. Impelzeri's work on ACWR. He makes an argument that ACWR isn't actually that accurate or useful in predicting injury.
I'm not really familiar with that individual, but I'm very familiar with like the systematic reviews that have been published on ACWR, and it's like on the whole, they would say it's probably the best metric that we can use at this point. And again, it's definitely not a perfect model, and there isn't one because everyone would use the same damn thing, but it's something that we have. And even if the model is not as precise as we would like, as long as we use the same thing, we're going to get some sort of value out of it. Because again, the goal, remember, is to just find some sort of sustainable training lifestyle that you can do and you can see progress and not get injured with. So I would say, I think it's a good one to use, and I've had good success using it. And the scientific literature would say, on the whole, I would say it's pretty accurate. Okay. But I'm not familiar with that guy.
Okay, we continue to have questions come in. Should we just limit it to like 5 more, or what?
Sure,
do you want
that's
to
fine.
keep going, buddy? Okay. When you see improvements in training capacity, but not significant improvement in performance, what variables do you typically look at first in a person's training as far as why they are not improving?
So they're improving their performance.
They're improving their training capacity, but not significantly improving their performance.
That means that the transfer is not very good. So maybe the exercise itself is not very specific to rock climbing. So an example would be like, do capacity tests for the lower extremity, doing a deadlift. You can build capacity for someone doing a deadlift, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to transfer to them climbing very well outside. I make that argument all the time for the 10-second weighted hang. People improve their capacity or their load with a 10-second hang, which is an improvement in capacity, but they very rarely directly see a transfer to the rock. That has everything to do with the time under tension, the rest intervals, the number of repetitions, like all of those things. So I would say maybe pick a different exercise if you're not getting the transfer that you're looking for. And it's hard to, assume, making the assumption that that's what they're asking or making that statement. So it's kind of tricky like that. But
This question is, how do you differentiate between progression and adaptation? I don't know if they're...
Progression should be adaptation as long as the athlete's not like overly fatigued, as long as they don't like feel like shit, right? Like if I have someone that's getting better at whatever it is that I'm training them for and they feel good and they're performing well, then I would say that's adaptation and progression at the same time. If I have someone that's performing relatively well and they feel terrible and they're tired all the time and they're grumpy, then they're not adapting. And certainly I would gauge that on other metrics as well, but maybe that answered that question.
Okay, since we're not going to get to all these questions, everyone. So again,
that's why I didn't stop to do questions.
Yep, and you guys can contact Tyler directly and
don't send me an email though. I will not respond to an email. Like I'll respond to Instagram because I can talk to it, but not an email. I don't like emails.
Okay. Should training or climbing be completely skipped on day with high stress, like school, family, other stressors, right? Or just reduced volume and intensity?
For sure. I think that's I love that question. Like definitely reduced volume, probably not reduced intensity, but definitely reduced volume. So if you were planning on training and you had a big family load, a bunch of, like I have some family stress going on right now. So like it makes tons of sense to not discontinue training. And at a minimum, we're going to want to load the fingers because that's one of the primary limiters in climbing. So find a way to load your fingers, but keep the volume super low. But you can try really hard still, and that's fine. The science on the connective tissue would say 30 minutes is enough of a stimulus to actually kickstart like all of the mechanical signaling in the connective tissue anyway. So 30 minutes at a minimum, keep the intensity high, and that's a great way to substitute it. But don't stop training. Even when people get injured, I very rarely say stop climbing. Even with pulley injuries, I usually have people still climb because it's not the load that's a problem. It's the dosage of the load that's a problem. That's the dangerous part, right? So, even if people have pains in a body part, elbows, shoulders, and fingers, there's always a way they can still find to load them, which is actually productive for the turnaround time for getting back to the sport.
Hey, everybody, you have been amazing with questions today. We love them all. We're not going to get to them all. We're almost 30 minutes over on this call. A couple of things that Tyler did mention: nutrition. We have like 3 other clinics in this series for you guys to dive into nutrition. Some of it is climbing specific and some of it approaches the general athlete. All super, super good for you. These conversations, obviously there's so much to them and we can keep going on, but definitely take advantage of the other clinics because some of the stuff that Tyler has discussed will be discussed in, from other clinics. So Tyler, you've been awesome. Thanks for going so much in depth. Guys, again, look for the email with this recording with contact for Tyler. Join his other clinics so you can go more in depth and get access to Tyler. And then also the PowerPoint will be in that as well. You guys are awesome. Have a great night. Be safe.
Thanks.